The way that I think of using my body as a psychotherapist is actually really paying a lot of attention to my own body as I'm working. Things that arise in me, and then pay a lot of attention to things that are arising in the client that may lie underneath the story. In TA we have this idea of script as a narrative, and we go back to an early scene that we can remember. Of course, all the time there's a body accompanying that narrative.
This is Three People in Your Head, a podcast about getting the best out of yourself and others. Co-hosted by Matt Taylor and myself, John Fleming.
In this episode, we speak with Steff Oates, who is a teaching and supervising transactional analyst in the psychotherapy field and runs a psychotherapy and supervision practice in the northwest of England. She's Vice President of Research and Innovation for the International TA Association and an occasional guest editor of the Transactional Analysis Journal, as well as being an author of numerous articles. We speak about Eric Berne's early work on intuition and protocol, and Steff's interest in integrating TA with other theories, especially body psychotherapy.
So welcome to the podcast, Steff. It's great to have you with us. So we might just start off with getting you to introduce yourself and telling us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, what your area of expertise is.
Right. Well, thanks for inviting me to get involved. I've heard some of the ones that you've done before and really appreciated it. So it's good to be here with you both. I live in the northwest of England, just south of Manchester, in a very rural area. Trained originally as a teacher, but I was never very good at it. So I had to move on to other pastures near. I was appalling at classroom discipline. So anyway. Then I did some social work.
Oh, very good.
I started doing a psychology degree, decided it would be a good idea to get my own therapy, and chanced upon a transactional analyst. I'd already heard of TA, actually, when I did my degree through the Open University. But then I found my first therapist and been hooked for about 30 years.
Very good.
30 years and still as passionate about it as I was then, I think. It's exciting to be involved in a world that keeps me engaged and on my toes.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I often think that TA is like food for the soul.
Yeah.
So you work as a psychotherapist and a teaching and supervising transactional analyst?
Yeah, I work as a psychotherapist. I have a small supervision practice because I closed it down a few years ago when I had some surgery, and I've just been building it up again. And then I train peripatetically these days. I used to have a training program a long time ago. These days I rather like to just go and train when people ask me to and where.
Yeah,
Great.
Very good.
I'm usually about a subject that I'm passionate about than, the run-of-the-mill curriculum-based TA training.
Yeah. And what sort of subjects are you passionate about?
Yes. Well, alongside my TA training, post-CTA, prior to my TSTA, I started training in body psychotherapy with various groups in Switzerland and in Paris. And then I set up a group of 4 of us actually set up something called the Northern College for Body Psychotherapy.
Oh, wow.
We brought in a variety of trainers over 10 years. We brought in different body psychotherapists. And then we used to really integrate TA with body psychotherapy in those days.
What was the drive to get involved in learning about body psychotherapy? Was there some stimulus there that got you interested?
The drive, I think, was that I could never quite understand how to put into words some of those very early experiences that hook us. And particularly with clients, I think, clients who were wordless, that I found very difficult in the early stages. And I can confess, I used to kind of get a bit pushy about getting them to add words to their experience and use those phrases that we used to use in those days. You can think and feel at the same time, which rather horrifies me now, but that's how it was back then.
Yeah.
I met Bill Cornell at a training event in 1999 and saw how he worked and thought, whoa, there is more for me to learn. And I went about finding out how to learn it.
Very good.
Can I just ask, So for somebody who's just listening, has never heard of body psychotherapy, can you give us a little idea of what body psychotherapy means or what it is?
If only I could. Well,
in one sentence, Steph, no pressure, but just one sentence, 5
just
words.
Roughly.
Well, I think probably the foundation of it was with a guy called Wilhelm Reich, who was also a psychoanalyst. What he was really interested in was how our body might armor itself. So he was interested in it as a theory of defenses held in the body. So he would do really quite vigorous work, very vigorous hands-on work. And the work was all about breaking down defenses.
Okay.
And was quite, at times I think could be quite aggressive.
Right, okay. Yeah. And it's interesting there that you mentioned about hands-on, because I know that from when I first started studying psychotherapy, I wasn't clear on what body psychotherapy was versus touch therapy and, where the line stops. So could you maybe help people understand a little bit more about how that gets divided up or understood? Or maybe it doesn't get divided up and understood as clearly as I would like it to, but...
Well, I'm not so sure it should be that clear, really, because I'm not sure that clear, if I'm truthful. So I think Wilhelm Reich really was interested in paying attention to the body, and then it's been developed over and over again. There are lots of people that have followed him. There's a whole kind of, family tree of people that use the body and developed approaches to the body. What I see these days in all of the different trainers that we employed in the Northern College for Body Psychotherapy is that all of them seem to be moving much more to a relational way of working. I hesitate to say that because I don't think it's relational. I think relational is another term that's not simple and is more often misunderstood than it's understood. But I think they're moving to a much more subtle way of working with the unconscious and what builds rather than coming in and breaking down defenses.
Okay.
The way that I think of using my body as a psychotherapist now, or even as a supervisor or a trainer, is actually really paying a lot of attention to my own body as I'm working.
Okay.
Things that arise in me, and then pay a lot of attention to things that are arising in the client.
Yes.
That may lie underneath the story. So, in TA we have this idea of script as a narrative, and we go back to an early scene that we can remember. Well, things that are, of course, all the time there's a body accompanying that narrative. I will watch for things like changes in voice tone or changes in skin color or changes in breathing, and for different kind of movements. But I think it's often misunderstood as body language or how people use their body or what we do to the body. But it's much more subtle than that. The ways that our body tell the story as well as our minds might tell the story and our words might tell the story.
That's really helpful. I think I also sometimes get confused about whether in body psychotherapy the therapist touches or makes physical contact with the client or not.
Well, I think a lot of body psychotherapists have done and may still do. Certainly in those early days, a lot of it was hands-on. Reich's patients would actually, I was thinking about UMAT actually, I think it might have been a bit more like physiotherapy. So patients would lie on the couch with just their underwear on, and he would be watching the defenses in the body and then paying attention to breaking down those defenses. In my early days of training, it wasn't so much touch like a physiotherapist, but the client would be invited to be much more active. And there were various techniques. So we would encourage clients to beat cushions with a bat or push against somebody or actually yield to somebody else's body. But I don't think people do that I don't do that so much anymore. I think people who've maybe been trained primarily in body psychotherapy might do it. But really, body psychotherapy for me was an adjunct to TA.
TA, yeah. Which is a really good segue into how have you connected TA to body psychotherapy? How have you formed a relationship between the two?
Well, in the beginning, I've been running the two alongside for probably 20 years now. So in the beginning, I was very interested in how some of the body psychotherapists might have thought about character in the same way that we might think about personality adaptations, or in a way that we might think about personality adaptations. So, Reich had, I think it was 5 basic character defenses. We have, I can't remember how many personality adaptations we have now, but anyway. So Reich had these basic character defenses. So I used to always wanted to be marrying the two,
Okay.
Is our schizoid like his schizoid? And is our hysteric like his hysteric? But it doesn't really work like that because, of course, nobody's completely a personality adaptation, a type. But each adaptation has its own struggles, I think. So I was really helped in the body psychotherapy training I was helped to shift from asking the question, what is wrong with this person, to asking the question like, what is this person struggling with in their defense system, which might be more bodily or more cognitive. So really I've moved, I think, to using the two things alongside each other to make meaning and help the client make meaning. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I like the way you use the term characteristics, because often we talk about things like adaptations, or like you say, we look for the problems or the difficulties, but you talked about characteristics, which I thought was interesting.
I might have said characteristics, or I might have just said character. I'm not sure whether I said characteristics.
Maybe I just missed it. I'll read that into it.
But it's a lovely pickup, actually, because I think that's what it is. Like, this is part of my character, and this is characteristic. But there is part of the theory that is a character defense. So,
the
big shift is from defining somebody as something to making meaning of people's characteristic. I think that's nice, actually. So it's moving from defining to making meaning, I think.
Great.
And how did you start to realize the difference in your practice then, Steff? Because obviously you continue training, so it must have been creating some sort of a shift for you in the way you were working. How did you begin to notice that in how your clients were responding, or was it the success you were having?
Yeah, well, not always the success. I was thinking of one particular example. So when I first started training, what happened was that I slowed things right down. So I talked much less. I interpreted much less. I watched much more, and I waited much more. When I say waited, I mean waited for something to emerge. And then I thought, this is the way to do it, of course. But then one client, what has happened to you? You're just sitting there like a Buddha.
That's so funny. So I suppose like any additional training you do, or methodologies, or tools or interventions, it works for some clients and not for others. Is that what you're saying?
That's one of my major passions, in a way, that we cannot get the client to fit the theory. And our theory is something that resources us, that can help us understand. But
you noted when we asked you, about who you are for the forms that we have, and which we do with all of our guests, you mentioned one of the things that you loved about TA was that it's a collaboration, and the client is just as involved with what's going on and just as responsible about the changes. And I found that as a therapist very liberating. So going from a hypnotherapy model or a mindfulness coach, and I'm delivering, that's my goal. I'm delivering, and trying to help and trying to give the tools. Whereas the TA, this kind of co-created thing, I think that is wonderful.
Well, I think it's ultimately empowering. I think that was the first thing that enchanted me, actually, was my very first therapist. I said, will you be able to help me? Because I'd had various psychologists before that. And he said, yes, but you're going to have to make some changes. And I immediately thought, I'm an active participant in this. I'm not a recipient. So.
It's interesting what happens when you're told that you're responsible for the progress that you make. I know for me that was a real shift in my own therapeutic journey as well, kind of being like, this is up to me. Like, I need to put the work in. And how have you, because I know you mentioned some of your early thoughts around how you were beginning to make sense of body psychotherapy in relation to TA. has that moved on and progressed over time as well about making new connections or maybe even challenging some of the existing TA theory and wondering, okay, was that still relevant today? Does that make sense when I look at it from the context of the body?
Yeah, very much so, actually. I think what I've discovered actually is that I think I'm naturally the kind of person that prefers a bottom-up process rather than a top-down process. And I've had a lot of therapy over my 30 years, and I think, in some ways I could go on forever creating more narratives and possibly creating further script. So it's like I put a new show on the road, which is what Eric Berne described. Then I make adaptations to my script. In some ways, the danger, I think, is that we can continually make over adaptations. So I think, okay, this is the way I am now. This is the way to be now. And there's another way to be now. And actually, as I really started experiencing changes in my own body or in my relationships, I started to think, the way that I want to be, or the opportunity that I want to afford to my clients, is that they emerge from within themselves rather than adapt to a system from outside of themselves. Does that make sense to you?
I think so. I'm just trying to fish around in my head and be like, I think I'm grasping it. Matt, were you going to say something?
When you say from the bottom up, what does that mean?
Okay, what I think is that the TA model, I think, it's a model of ego, really. It develops probably from, 2 onwards when we start developing our script. So then I think, actually, there's quite a lot that's happened before that. One sense is as much of the essence of me than what developed after that. So if I think about script developing, from a time when we've got cognition and words, not necessarily that many words, but, we've got a way to symbolize and we've got a way to understand the world. And underneath that, there's a whole part of our existence that isn't really accounted for. But Eric Berne wrote about protocol as the foundation of script. So this is what happens in the very, very earliest weeks, months of our life, or even in gestation, I imagine.
Yeah. Okay, I'm getting what you mean by from the bottom up now. And now I'm thinking about some of the models in educational TA that I've really connected with, which is the cycle of development, and particularly with the stage becoming, which wasn't initially in the cycle of development, it was an addition. And it is in child development meant to represent the 9 months of gestation. And for me in my own journey, that's been a really important part of understanding who I am, what makes me tick, why my script is the way that I am. But you're right. Traditionally, script theory would have been from 2 or 3, 7 or whatever it is. So what you're saying is that you're trying to you are accounting for the bit that comes before that, which isn't about ego. It's about, you use the word essence.
I think that's the way that I like to think about it. And of course, it's not just the essence of us, it's the essence of the culture into which we were born. And I was thinking about the educational TA, because Giles has written a beautiful article on natality. He really writes about the coming into life. So that's what I'm meaning about a kind of bottom up. TA is incredibly attractive, I think, for people to make meaning of the world. When I first came to it, I thought, oh my God, that's why I do that. Oh, that's why I do that.
Yeah.
It's incredibly enlivening, and it has limitations if we keep it just to script, I think, that we can really start to unfold what happened before then.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to probe you on one thing before we continue on this. You mentioned protocol a while ago, that Eric Berne had written about protocol. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and what that means?
Well, he wrote about it in his earlier books, and then he wrote about it in, I think, 1972, actually. What do you say after you say hello, actually, it's mentioned. He didn't write an awful lot about it, but he wrote about it as the foundation, or the analge. I've never really understood that word. The analge before script. So it's really just what I've said. But the difficulty is that it's kind of unknowable. I wrote something about the ineffable quality of protocol, like it's unknowable. So then I think we have to feel it. So that's where I get really excited about Eric Berne's emphasis on phenomenology. We have four ways of diagnosing, he talks about diagnosing ego states.
Ego states, yeah.
We've got the behavioral, the social, the historical, and the phenomenological. And because it's such a difficult word to say, people forget it a lot. So I often think that TA gets reduced to the social, behavioral, and historical. Well, in fact, Berne said, until you have all four methods of diagnosing ego states, then you don't do it, really. So we have to get a sense of people's felt sense as well as their narrative.
The felt experience, yeah.
Yeah, the lived experience.
The lived experience.
I think it's the felt experience too, but I don't think it's just about emotion. It's about the lived experience, which is often got to through an emotion or through feeling.
Yeah. Or when I was saying the felt experience, I was also thinking about how I might feel it in my body.
Yeah.
That it might be a sensation or actually I want to use the word intuition. Like I might feel it in my gut. I might be thinking, I have a gut feeling about this.
Sorry, John, I misinterpreted you there. Actually.
Yeah, but I wasn't being clear because we use the word feel or felt without really being clear on what are we feeling. Is it an emotional feeling or a physical feeling? So, yeah. So, Steff, what I'm making sense of in my head is that Eric Berne was already onto something here in his early writings, that he was, I don't know if you want to use the phrase dropping hints or kind of alluding to something without maybe elaborating it on. And it seems like you have, or maybe he has elaborated on it quite extensively and I'm not aware of it. But it sounds like through your body psychotherapy training, you were able to make a greater sense of what he was referring to when he said protocol and when he was mentioning phenomenological diagnosis.
Well, through my body psychotherapy training and also through a brilliant article that Bill Cornell and Mick Landesh wrote. They wrote an article about, they called it Impasse and Intimacy. It's a really fabulous article and profound for me because what they wrote about was that actually when a therapist and client might get into an impasse, something stuck between them, then they work through that together within the lived experience. And they really contrasted working in the lived experience of the protocol with any process of redecision. That actually what happens is the protocol gets reorganized rather than redecided. So I live through something with someone and then things start to shift.
So can I ask, when you say that they work through the lived experience, what would that be like? Say for a client who is, in that room, how does that work together? What would that experience be like?
Well, without wanting to get too much onto another topic, if we bring, the other topic might be enactment, so which I don't want to go into now because we could set a whole podcast on that. What I'm thinking is that if I bring my whole self into the room with the client who brings their whole self into the room, then in a way I've got an openness to the kind of unconscious communication that the client is bringing and the client to me. So there's a kind of willingness to be open. Something emerges that gets lived through together. So I think about an example of a client where something happens, I miss a tune, the client gets angry. We don't then try to work it out in a, what went wrong where, or we don't work it out in a transactional way, or we don't understand it through game theory or any of the other things that point to something. We live through understanding it together until something starts to emerge that brings meaning. The example I often give is that when I started to learn to ski, I couldn't learn it through books. I couldn't learn it through behavior. I was in the beginner's class for 12 years. But the way that I learned to ski was where the skiing instructor suddenly noticed that I needed something different and I needed him to be more involved than other people might have needed. So, he put his arms around my arms and his legs around my legs and his skis around my skis. and he skied me down the mountain. So we lived it together in a kind of psychosomatic partnership, and I was able to learn it in a sensory motor way. I'd skied like that after that. I only needed that one time, plus all the other 12 years of trying to learn it. I only needed that one time to be able to win the race that week.
Yeah. That's really interesting because, and again, I don't want to go off on a mad tangent here now as well, because we could and go in a different direction. But what gets stimulated in me when you say that is like, you could compare it to education in the sense of that there's different learning styles. So people are kinesthetic or they're linguistic or whatever it might be. And what I'm hearing is that there's a tad of a suggestion here that maybe in therapy, people like to receive therapy in different styles or different ways as well, and that they may respond to them in more quickly or more efficiently or whatever word you want to use, depending on the style that the therapist is delivering. Is that?
Yeah, and they might be reached in different ways.
Yeah.
So if I think about the early clients who I was pushing to verbalize because I was uncomfortable with the silence, I wouldn't do that now. I might speak to it myself. I might say, I'm wondering what's happening in the silence, but without any expectation of them having to come back with anything. Kind of wondering and watching and waiting feel to, rather than, what are we going to do today?
And when you say early clients, you're talking about clients that you believe there is work to do with early experiences in their life, pre-verbal or very early stage of life.
I don't think it necessarily has to be necessarily from an early stage of their life. They might be thrown back into a place where they don't have so many words or so many thoughts. So I don't think it has to be a kind of explicit memory of an early scene or something that actually happened. But there's that vulnerability that we can play with to let something emerge to bring.
Okay, yeah. So it doesn't mean that this is only approach for clients with pre-verbal or pre-birth trauma. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be trauma. Like it's, yeah, okay. That's interesting.
And I think a willingness to be there with the client in what they're experiencing and what you're experiencing in the moment without having to necessarily impose a meaning before it's ready to emerge.
Yeah, because I can think about how frustrating it is when a client doesn't have words. I know that from my own practice and my own clients where I've had those situations. I know that they find it frustrating. I have my own experience of it personally as well, and I can understand and appreciate how there may be a desire on the client side to want to understand what happened or what went on and just really being lost for an explanation. So this seems like a really appropriate way to approach something that's quite delicate.
Yes, and John, I think the same can happen the other way, actually, that people can come in with too many words and too many understandings or a more sophisticated understanding, and they might need help to soften down or given time to sit with themselves or sit with me.
I'm thinking as well about how that sophisticatedness or the elaborate, theorizing of an understanding of themselves could be a defense. I definitely can attest to that being my personal experience. I love to figure things out, and have a running theory about what's going on. And I've had 16, 17 years of therapy. And the early days, I used to jump around therapists because I was moving a lot. So I moved around the UK and Ireland a lot. And I remember one therapist I went to, it was a few years before I started TA training, and she was an art therapist. I'd never done art therapy before, and I was doing it because I'd never done it before, and I wasn't going to be able to go in with my elaborative explanation of what was going on. And she laughed in the first session and said, I can tell that you've had a lot of therapy. You're what I call therapized. You're able to explain what's going on. But she said it's to the extent actually that it's become unhelpful. I wasn't actually able to connect with myself. It was all up in my head thinking, but I wasn't feeling anything. So yeah, it can work both ways. You're right. It's interesting.
I think Eric Berne was such an interesting guy. I'd love to have met him because I think it seems to me from his early papers on intuition, that actually he really had that capacity to sit with and wonder about. And then as the theory developed, to me it got more concrete, I think. So I think the early part was much more mysterious, and then the later part was much more concrete.
So you would see a lot of his work as being initiated from his intuition and then it becoming more cerebral.
Well, I don't know that he ever did. As I say, I didn't actually meet him, but if you read in 2010, there was a DAJ that was celebrating his centenary or what have you. So one of his clients wrote an article, one of his ex-clients wrote an article about him. And it seems like as a therapist, it seems like he was much more available and attentive to the subtleties than some of the writings might indicate. So I think he must have been a fascinating mix.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it was all with the headiness of San Francisco in the 1960s that people wanted freedom. They wanted a way out, really. And in some ways, I think we've gone too much to finding a way out. And actually, we might need to find a way in, a way into ourselves.
Yeah, or a way home. It sounds very cliche, kind of like Eat, Pray, Love or something. But you know what I mean. I wanted to just go back a minute because you said a while ago that you've read some of Eric Berne's early writings on intuition. What was it that Eric Berne had to say about intuition, and why has that interested you? You know, and how is it that you connect the two, protocol and intuition?
I think it was fascinating, really, because in some of the early papers, I can't remember the theory exactly now, but he wrote about being able to interview soldiers and to decide what career path would be or their job in the army would be, just from asking them 3 questions.
I know what you're referring to now because it's in this book I'm reading about him. So he worked in the American Army Corps as a psychiatrist. And I think it was when they were being discharged and he was in a long line of doctors. So they got to spend 30 seconds with each doctor and he was the last boot. And he set him this task. He would ask them 3 questions, but before they answered them, he would decide what the answers were in his head. And he was making all these notes. So he actually essentially did a research study. Yeah. And he proved that intuition, according to himself, I don't think it was validated by a university or anything, but that intuition was valid and that it was possible because he started noticing that the answers he was getting from the soldiers were the ones he had decided he was going to get beforehand. And he only met them for 30 seconds.
And that's where he was using his own phenomenology to really, what's going on here. And then he starts to build an image of these people and then he starts to test the image out with the facts. Yeah.
So that makes sense. And that's how you connect it to the body psychotherapy because it's about seeing what I used as the felt experience. You were saying the lived experience is when you are with the client in the room, you're using that. You're using your intuition to understand the phenomenological aspect of what might be going on. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And do you have a way of teaching or explaining to your clients what intuition is and how to develop that? Have I asked another one of those questions?
No, I'm just wondering. Sometimes it takes me time to kind of work out what I think. Well, I'm not so sure that we develop it. I think we have it from the beginning and that we forget it. So
right.
That's my sense.
Yeah.
So we're almost taught to no longer listen to it and to focus on our thinking or our conceptualizing.
That's my sense. So that's why I think it's hard to do over a podcast because I think when I'm teaching, I often get people in triads and I think Eric Berne might have done this. I think he had an intuition experiment where he would get people to sit for a long time and really get much more of a felt sense. We're back there again. Much more of a felt sense in what was going on with the other person.
I remember doing an exercise when I was doing some counseling training, and the exercise was to stand behind somebody and place your hand on their shoulder, and they had to think of an experience that either made them angry, sad, or fearful. And the person behind with a hand on the shoulder had to guess. And it was bizarre how accurate that was. I genuinely thought, this isn't going to work, is it? And in my group that I work with, we got it 100%. Everybody got the right answer. I was really surprised at how accurate it was.
And it's interesting about thinking about whether it's intuition or not, because what I've recently been thinking about is like how much we communicate unconsciously. So if we could call it intuition, and we might just call it unconscious communication.
Yeah.
I was thinking about I've written about this client actually, where I was watching her have some very, very intense feelings. I had a kind of counter-transferential response, which I thought, oh, this isn't very nice. I started to feel a bit persecutory, and so that's not normally how you feel towards your clients. Why do you suddenly feel like, torturing her? So then if I'm able to use that unconscious communication, and then I can bring it up and say, you seem like you're being tortured, because that's kind of been processed through my body. And then she was able to say, I do. And then to give me a narrative of, what was behind the torture. So I don't know whether I would call that intuition or whether I would call that unconscious communication, that I'm in a place to receive and interpret and give a trial interpretation, actually, not necessarily interpret.
Yeah, that's a great example.
And what seems always important with that is about trusting yourself in what's coming up. I know that's definitely been a journey for me in my intuition, is actually listening to it. I don't know how many times I've been in a situation where I've had a strong urge to say or do something, and then the moment passes and I was like, oh, why didn't I do it? I even have that in learning experiences sometimes, when somebody says, oh, what's the answer to this? And I get a strong gut response. And then I just sit there and freeze up because I don't trust myself enough to go with whatever is coming up. So there is a development in trusting. But I like what you've said about it's always there. It's about whether we're accessing it or not.
And I think trusting is a really important thing, because I think that's what I've learned, is to stay with it. Like that uncomfortable feeling I didn't really like very much. I thought, God, Steff, why are you suddenly feeling like you want to torture somebody? That's not like you. But to feel it and then wait until I can speak to it with some dignity, because it wasn't sounding very dignified in my body, I can tell you. So, but then to wait to speak to it with some dignity, such that it can bring meaning.
You were saying a while ago about getting into yourself, I think, and I introduced the idea of coming home to yourself. Do you think it's in that process that the trust begins to be built, or that you begin to gather trust?
Trust in myself, or trust?
Trust in the intuition or the unconscious communication. Do you think the practitioner needs to have gone through that process first?
Yeah. And I think actually all of us, as clients and as practitioners, need to give ourselves more time for most things, which, somebody who's been diagnosed with ADD, that's a bit challenging sometimes. Actually, if I can then just slow myself right down, slow my breathing down, and pay as much attention as possible to what's going on in the moment, so that I'm not racing forward to provide an interpretation or provide the words. I think I've spent a lot of my last 10 therapy years, teaching myself, and then in the process teaching my clients to stay with my experience rather than to move away from my experience.
So, Steff, would you like to see more of a focus in transactional analysis on the inclusion of bodywork in training? What's your thoughts on that?
Not so much on bodywork in training, but I think what I'd like to see more of is people looking beyond the script, so looking beneath the script. So I'd like to see more depth and more questioning of the theory.
Yeah.
We had an international webinar a few weeks ago, and people were saying, maybe our theory needs to shift, like the theory needs to shift what Giles and Haley are doing in terms of climate change, but also maybe our theory needs to shift from being a more individualistically determined theory. I want to get this for me. I want to get free of my script, to really helping people make more meaning of their experience and more meaning of their lives. And again, from the bottom up rather than the top down is what I think is more passionate.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because on the panel discussion, Anna Chandy from India was saying that in India, there's definitely a drive now as a result of the pandemic to look more at collectivism again, and which is where they had come from. And she felt like when they strayed away from collectivism, they were in no man's land because this individualistic approach never worked for their culture. So it does look like we need to be looking more at what can I do for us as opposed to what can I do for me.
Yes, yes.
You know, and that actually leads me on to a nice little question. Is it kind of erupted out of Rosemary's podcast, which is the fact that Eric Berne declared TA should not be political. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about whether you think TA should be political or not.
Well, I don't think it cannot be. It's all around us. It's within us. I think when Eric Berne was making those statements, there were a lot of sensitivities around. So things were of their time. And many of the models that we have in TA were of their time, and they need updating. I think the other thing that I would want to see in training organizations and training institutes is more of maybe like a postmodern perspective, like this is not the truth. You are not three people in your head. Sorry to use that, but it's not not concrete as that. It's dynamic. And I think sometimes when we get these concretized models, trainees take them away as if all I am is be strong.
Absolutely, yeah. I really like the introduction of constructivism because it really knocks that right out of the park and says, well, nothing is anything, it is only whatever you might think it is in that moment, and then that moment is gone. So,
I love the way that in some of your answers you described neurodiversity. You talked about neurodiversity, and I'm a really strong believer that we use these labels to put people in boxes and to fit them into a little schema that we have. And we're all just on this huge continuum of different measures, but we so want to just tidy everything up when it's not the case. Like you say, the three ego states is just a model, and a model is always inaccurate and not wholly the truth, but it's useful, but it's not everything.
Yeah. Well, you see, that's when we get stuck up here again in our heads. And we get attached to the framework rather than, maybe like you were saying, the more felt experience would help us integrate it in a more healthy way than just thinking, oh, I'm being parent now. Oh, now I'm being adult. Oh, now I'm being child. It's not as simple as that.
I love what you've called your podcasts. I'm not feeling critical.
Oh yeah, I know.
Because I think that's the dynamic tension really, because of course we'll grab people. Because we all have three people at least in our heads. So that will grab people. But
well, yeah, we're being a bit provocative as well, I think, intentionally provocative.
I think I'm against anything being fixed, really, and anything being the truth.
Yeah, I completely agree that there is always our subjective view and everybody sees the world slightly differently. And one of the challenges, and this is modern science, there is no way of measuring experiences yet. And so an experience is everything, really, when, it's all about our experience.
But that's the very problem, Matt. We don't need to measure it.
Science wants to.
Oh, I know, but that's why science...
out a table and put things in boxes.
Science needs to go. It's had its heyday. It's only ever as accurate as they know now. That's the thing. But science is always so certain. It's like, well, we know. But next year it'll say, oh, actually, that was completely wrong. Yeah. So true. So that leads nicely on as well, Steff, to just asking you, because obviously this is targeted at people who may know little or nothing about TA and it's their introduction to it and learning all about the different fields. What sort of common myths do you think exist about TA that you might like to debunk?
I don't know if I'd put it on the questionnaire, but there is that lovely joke about Eric Berne and Patrick Moore. Do you know it?
No, I don't know.
So Eric Berne meets Patrick Moore on an aeroplane, and Patrick Moore says to Eric Berne, I hear you're a transactional analyst. That's parent, adult, child, isn't it? And Eric Berne said, yes. And tell me a bit more about yourself. And Patrick Moore says, oh, I'm an astronomer. And Eric Berne says, oh, yes, I know that. That's Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, isn't it? And, there's so much more. There is.
Yeah. That's very funny. I haven't heard that before. I get a good giggle out of that. That's very good. Yeah, very appropriate. And why do you think that TA isn't so well known in the general public?
That's another reason why I'm really glad you guys are doing what you're doing, by the way, because I don't think it is as well known as it should be. There are two thoughts I have about it. One is that people like CBT people, put an awful lot of money into research that can be validated and outcome measurement. I don't think we can really measure, just as you said. I don't think we can measure experience. And the other thing I think is that I think it did go through a phase of, being a pop psychology where people really didn't take it as seriously as they might do. And what I think is that it has an enormous breadth and an enormous depth. And I think it can be pummeled, and I've just been making bread this afternoon. So I think it can be pummeled and kneaded and pulled and stretched and still hold its shape. So I think it's a fantastic theory for that. I don't know if I've answered your question about whether...
Yeah, no, you have. Yeah, and I agree, because it is unique TA as well, which is the other thing about it, in the fact that it has 4 distinct fields of application, and that it's a social psychology, because some modalities that are primarily therapeutic based are very much focused on the individual. And I know that when I've taught my clients TA, or I've run some personal development courses in the past, the thing that people have always enjoyed is being able to understand the dynamic that goes on between them and other people. And that's what got me attracted to it as well. When I started about transactions, I was like, oh my God, this is so helpful. So, Steff, just before we finish up, are you working on any exciting projects at the moment?
Well, I'm Vice President of Research and Innovation of the ITAA, so that keeps me as busy as my private practice. Yeah, it's very dear to me, the international community, so I really like promoting the journal that we have.
So what is it about the TAJ that you think is so special? What is its value?
It's a peer-reviewed journal, so it's got a very strong academic base, so I think it helps us get more known in the world of academia. I love that it's 4 fields, but unfortunately we don't seem to be able to get many counsellors to write for us. So, we need to broaden it out to counsellors. I really want to influence the journal to have its academic credentials and to have articles that aren't beyond the reach of people not wanting to delve into that level of intellectual rigor or something like that.
Yeah, great.
So that's the balance I'm wanting to get. People like Giles. People like Giles are such brilliant writers, and Beale, actually.
Well, thank you so much, Steff. It's been a pleasure. If people are interested in making contact with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
By email.
Great, perfect. And we can put your email in the show notes. You'll be able to get Steff's email there if you do want to make contact.
And it's it's lcfan, not icfan.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
I feel like I've learned a lot.
Yeah, it's been really valuable. As always, if you found anything in today's episode interesting, please feel free to reach out. If you would like some more information on TA, or you'd like to see some TA resources, then head over to our website, transactionalanalysispodcast.com. You can also connect with us on all major platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. You can also email us at 3peopleinyourhead@gmail.com using the number 3 rather than the word. And if you haven't already, please follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and we would be really grateful if you could leave us a review. Thanks for listening.